Welcome to the audio podcast ministry of The Bridge. In all that we do, our priority is to lead all people from all places to be all in with Jesus. We hope that by providing this message in this way, it will be an encouragement to those of you who have already decided to follow Jesus, as well as a way home for those of you who have not yet said yes to Him. You can find out more, as well as support this ministry, by going to bridgeclarksville.com.
So on Sunday, to introduce the two commandments that we talked about, don't commit adultery, don't murder, you began by talking about like TV ratings and how these commandments would be, TVMA with the letters S and V on there. But it got me thinking, we didn't have that as a kid when we were growing up. Our parents were just kind of haphazardly, I guess, figuring out what we could or couldn't watch. Was that an issue? Growing up?
Well, I lived outside the city limits, and we didn't have cable. And cable was invented, but they didn't run it out to our house. You could only have one of those huge satellites in the yard, and I just don't think my dad was hip to putting that monster in the yard. I think he just felt like it was. Maybe it lacked a little class that he felt like maybe we should have as a family, which we probably didn't. But he wasn't all about that satellite. So when it came time for a game on ESPN or TNT or TBS, I'd go over to my friend's house and watch the games. But as far as lying there in front of the television and just mindlessly watching TV, I didn't. It was either NBC, CBS, Fox, or ABC, and that was those were the options. And so we didn't really. I think. For the most part, censorship during the 80s kept it from being a big issue. I'm sure there were some things I shouldn't have seen that I saw, but it was nothing compared to what maybe I could have if we had cable or premium channels, of course. So,
well, I remember there's several 80s movies that I watched, late 80s, early 90s when I was, 10, 11, 12, 13 in there. That I thought, well, I want to show my kids these because they're great movies. And then I started watching them with my kids when they were about my age then. And I'm thinking, what in the... Like a PG in the 80s is about an R now. I think that's about where it is.
The language, for sure.
Yeah.
I've, as time's gone on, Ferris Bueller or The Goonies or something will pop up, and you're thinking, wow... Yeah, I really didn't know these kids were cussing like that. I just didn't process a lot, so I've just stopped. I stopped trying that a while back. And but when we were married and had kids, we stuck to the ratings. And if it was, if it had PG-13 on it, they weren't going to watch it until they were 13. But like you said, there were some that seemed to sneak in. Yeah, and it's surprising now going back and looking at it. And it's also surprising how bad those movies were. Yeah, they're just really not interesting.
No, terrible. And after you watch, CGI now, and you go back to those, how are we entertained by that?
Yeah, it's not even funny.
Not at all.
It's hard to get through it, really. So.
Well, so these commands would be those that would probably, our parents would have said, yeah, probably not, or I don't know, maybe they wouldn't have, but, they're definitely the two that grab our attention. I like how you mentioned... if we went to apologize to somebody or to confess to somebody that we broke the Sabbath or one of the others, okay. But if we said, hey, I've committed adultery or I've murdered, however that would be defined, then that would be a whole different kind of response. The reason that you mentioned for these being maybe on a kind of a tier that in our perspective, especially the commandments that deal with our relationships with each other, being on a different kind of tier is that it involves other people. Like you mentioned, it brings them into our rebellion. And a point you made is that the reason that's so terrible is that it's against other people who have value and who have purpose. So why is it so important to remember that truth or recognize that truth if there's one of these issues that maybe pops into our mind or we begin to think about pursuing in some way? What is that truth of knowing, well, God created them with value and purpose that should, other than the obvious, well, God created with value and purpose, but should cause us to pause a little bit?
I think sometimes when we willingly, knowingly choose to rebel against God's plan, specifically these 10 commandments that we're looking at this summer, I think we do so always thinking, really, what's the hurt? It's my choice. I'm going to do this. It's not hurting anyone else. But when it comes to sexual sins or violent sins, you can't really say it's not hurting anyone else. And when it comes to sexual sins, usually there's someone driving the car. I mean, both people usually don't just make a pact, hey, let's break God's laws together on three. It's just somebody is pushing the envelope. And when you're doing that, you are bringing someone else in, and you're causing them to be a part of the decision that you've made to violate a command. So the guilt and shame that maybe you were willing to deal with for the cost of breaking the sin because you wanted to be a part of that, or breaking the law rather, they're being now forced to deal with the same guilt, the same shame, and it wasn't even on their plan to be a part of that. They just are in it because you created that environment or you brought them in. And so two people are going through the same issues because one person really drove that home. And so in that way, you're causing them to second guess their own value. They're going to look at themselves differently in the mirror. They're certainly going to approach God differently with that kind of guilt and conviction on their hearts. And so it's in many ways destroying the story that God's laid out for them, just because you were selfish enough to think, I know it's wrong, but I want to feel that way, or I want to experience that, or I want to see that, or I want to know what that's about, instead of thinking, okay, God's got a plan for you, God's got a plan for me, and I don't want to wreck your plan. So I think that in that way, it's a problem. And so I think stepping back and realizing that God has dreamed up a life and a story for these other individuals, and it's just not our place to step in with that authority and pull that innocence away, or pull that peace away that they were already experiencing in their lives. So I think that's one aspect of it.
And that's something I think is easy for us to get our minds around, probably when it comes to the idea of adultery. That's pretty clear. Now, Jesus took it a step further, and he actually went to the heart of the law of don't look with lustful intent, because in that you're committing adultery. And even in, not to ignore the end of violence, but in that, people may say, well, I'm not actually bringing anybody else in to this activity. It's just me, and you mentioned, you talked about porn, and that's something that, stats say affects a vast majority of all people. Mm-hmm. How does that affect other people? If it's just you viewing that and whatever else comes along with it, how is it affecting?
Well, I think it's a lot to that, but I think part of it is there is scientific evidence that those images rewire your brain. So you are not the same person after exposing yourself to pornography or to those things for extended periods of time. I don't mean as far as minutes, hours. I mean just in a season of life. That exposure literally rewires your brain. And I guess if you're never going to get married, you're never going to have kids, never going to have friends, or never leave your house, maybe it doesn't affect anyone else. But we all live in community. A lot of people are going to be a part of families, and you can't just leave that behind, because you're putting all of yourself into your relationships with your spouse, if you have one, kids, if God chooses to bless you with those kids, or even your friendships. I mean, it changes those things. It changes the dynamic between you and God. And so if I'm not honest and pursuing Jesus to my fullest potential, then I'm also affecting the people around me. If I'm not walking with Jesus with a very honest, intimate way, I'm not able to give all of myself to my wife, to my kids. I'm not able to lead the people that God's placed around me in my church family. I'm not at my best. So in a way, it still affects everyone, because then I'm trying to point people to Jesus in the back of my mind, having some bit of guilt or having some bit of shame, or trying to hide something. I'm not fully leading. I'm not fully into it, because There's a part of me that's warped, and there's a part of me that's struggling and in the dark. So there's no way that those sins are just affecting me. But even if they are, they're affecting my ability to be able to relate with God in an honest, intimate way, and that's still enough to destroy. So I don't think there's any way you can say, well, this sin just affects me.
And I think even on the violence end, when Jesus says, if you have hate in your heart towards someone else, hate there, it's kind of the same thing that's going to affect, even if we don't act in aggression towards a person, it's definitely going to hinder our relationship with the Lord when we harbor that. We'll probably walk around frustrated. We'll be that jerk in traffic or whatever. Yeah. So even in that, like, we can't excuse those things away as just being, but I'm not acting on this. Well, it is causing an issue in your life. Mm-hmm. You also mentioned how there are these great heroes we look at in Scripture in the Old Testament that broke these commandments, but it didn't disqualify them in a way. Like, God still used them. And you mentioned Abraham, who committed adultery, and Moses, who committed murder, and you also about David, who kind of double whammy for him. It's really encouraging to look at those examples, and you can look all through Jesus' genealogy and you see examples of people who were sinful and messed up, but yet God still used them, and that's encouraging to see. But why? Like, what's the why behind that God didn't just say, okay, well, you're no longer useful, let me try somebody else?
Yeah, well, I think over and over again throughout Scripture we've got that phrase. I think you and I actually maybe even talked about it in a different conversation last week, but it over and over, for the sake of my name, I'm going to do this. For the sake of my name, I'm going to do this. For the sake of my name, I'm going to rescue you. And in a sense, it's a good reminder that it's God's story and God's movement and God's purposes that are going to prevail. The whole point of life is not, well, the more perfect you are, the more things God will do, more great things God will do through you. God has a story, and he has an end, and he's going to use broken people along the way, and no one is ever too broken to be a part of that. Now, I think selfishly, it's nice to look at that and say, well, God used them so that people like us could realize, hey, we can be used too. And I'm sure there's a part of that, but it's less about Abraham, and it's more about the story that God was writing in this nation he was creating. It's less about Moses and more about the fact that God, from the very beginning, had identified Moses and chosen him and set him apart. And there's nothing that Moses could do along the way that would get him to a point where God was willing to say, I can no longer use him. And so I think that's part of it. I think about the story of Jonah. Jonah had hatred in his heart. He didn't follow through with murder, and maybe not even with violence, but he had hatred in his heart towards a group of people. God allowed him to be swallowed up with this giant creature in the water. And then when he was spit back out, God gave him the same mission. It's almost as if he said, well, yeah, you messed up, and here you go. And Jonah said, well, now what do I do? Well, you do the same thing I told you to do before you rebelled. This hasn't changed my story and my plan, and I'm still big enough to use you in spite of what you did to try to get away. Yeah. So I think, in a way, that applies to all of those legends of the faith.
Yeah, I love that. It goes around as a meme now sometimes, but a phrase, we may have even said it in one of these, that when God saved you, he took your stupidity into account. Like, he understands, he knows. I mean, he knows what our life's going to be, the decisions we're going to make. His grace has covered that already, and it's not, it's not this freedom to go and do whatever, but it's an encouragement that, man, I can return. Mm-hmm. I can run back to him. I can fall at his feet again and again and again and again, because these are things that aren't surprising him. And so there was a lot of encouragement and teaching to be mindful of these things in our own life. And at the end, you also talked about what about those of us who have had maybe these things committed against us? If someone were to come to you just in a pastoral counseling moment, and someone had committed adultery against them in some way, or there's some sort of assault, even if it's physical, how would you maybe offer some counseling to them? What might be something you would say, first step, moving forward?
I think at first you've got to realize that the main offense was not against you, even though you were the offended. Their first responsibility is to deal with what happened between God and them. I mean, that's their first sin, even if it was hurting me or hurting this person that I would, be speaking with, it was against God. Like, they have a spiritual issue, a vertical issue that ultimately was so raw that it ended up hurting their horizontal relationship. So the issue is God and them first. And so I think I would begin there, because we've all been hurt, we've all been betrayed, we've all been lied to, we've all been in some way led astray. We might not have all been the victim of adultery or victim of violence or bullying or anything like that, but we've experienced some bit of that. And I think the starting point is it's not you didn't deserve this. It was a spiritual problem, whether it was arrogance or whether it was some unconfessed sin or something that they're dealing with, that you ended up being the physical, visible target, but it was really not about them in the beginning. And so I think I just start there, because if you feel like, well, this person committed adultery against me because I wasn't enough, this is not the case, because that individual is never going to be satisfied with a particular person until he gets right or she gets right what's going on between God and them, and that's just not the case. And usually those moments of violence, whatever they may be, those are pent up, long-lasting issues that have been underlying this whole time, and they just exploded. And the one who was the closest got it, and it's just it's horrible, it's tragic, it's unfortunate. Watching and listening to everything that's unfolded with the assassination attempt on Trump, I mean, there's a lot that goes into those backstories, and you never know. It wasn't just one day, today I think I'll go commit this violence. It's usually maybe years of things that have been built up and built up and built up, and then opportunity affords itself, and boom. And it's just, it's a horrible thing. But it's rarely the person that's directly first offended that has anything to do with what's really going on. It's a lot more. So I think once these relationships are messed up, then it's just really beware for what happens around you.
Yeah, and it's there's some great clarity that I think it brings when we're talking about our vertical relationship and our horizontal relationships, that they are interdependent on each other, that we may feel like this is good with God, but if there is any of this with someone else, this isn't good.
Right.
Or we may feel this is good, but if we're not really following Jesus, we know there's issues here. Well, ultimately these aren't good either. Right. And so at the end of the day, I love that challenge of, even for the one who was the aggressor, either in adultery or in violence against us. There's as hard as it is, it's easy to say. I think we both would get that. Really hard to be in the middle of it. But if we can know, okay, there's something off with them and God, might help us have a little mercy, a little grace shown. Doesn't mean we just walk away. There's probably things that need to be dealt with. But as a first step and first thought, I think that's really good. So this upcoming Sunday, I know we've got something a little different happening.
We'll have some guests that are going to be serving in another country, just as a part of what's going on. But the command that I'll be working through is not to covet, just to learn the secret of contentment, and which is a challenge. And these friends of ours who are missionaries are in the middle of need, and so I think there's a good lesson there of just losing everything or not having any of the things that we count on, and learning that. So we'll do that this week.
It'll be a good Sunday. Looking forward to it. Thank you guys for joining us for this conversation, and we do hope we get to see you this Sunday at the Bridge.
Thank you for joining us today. If you live in the area, we hope you will soon join us in person. If you were unable to do that, we hope you will continue to stay connected with us by following this podcast and sharing it with your friends. For more information, go to bridgeclarksville.com.